Alright, so let's dive into this whole nine-dash line thing in the South China Sea. It's like a huge topic, and honestly, people outside China might look at it and go, what? Why is China so assertive about this? Like, it's right up there next to other countries' territory. But when you really think about it, the nine-dash line isn't just some recent development. It's been China's thing for a really long time, like, since ancient history. Now, when you look at the map, you'll see this line that zigzags all over the South China Sea. And yeah, it's got a couple of points where it practically touches the doorsteps of countries like the Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam. But the question is, why is China claiming all of this? Well, like, first things first, it's not just a random line. It has deep historical and legal roots. In fact, this line was drawn based on China's historical rights over these waters, not just some spontaneous decision that's happening now. Let's break down the basic concepts. We've got two main things going on here: China's South Sea and the South China Sea. You might be thinking, wait, isn't that the same thing? Well, not exactly. So the China South Sea is all about sovereignty, like who owns the territory. This area is roughly 2.1 million square kilometers. That's a lot of ocean. On the flip side, the South China Sea is more of a geographic term, referring to the body of water that stretches across the Western Pacific, and it's about 3.5 million square kilometers. So the nine-dash line, what's its deal? It's China's boundary for its maritime rights in the South China Sea. Basically, anything inside that line belongs to China, including the islands, reefs, and the surrounding seas. That means China has control over everything from territorial waters to exclusive economic zones. But China's reasoning is that historically, this sea and all the islands have been Chinese territory. And when you look at the map, it's pretty wild, honestly. The line's shaped like a big U. Alright, so now let's take a deeper look at these specific points along the line. The first part is near the Bashi Channel, which separates Taiwan from the northern Philippines. This area is super deep, like more than 5,000 meters deep in places. And that makes it an important route for international shipping, right? It's a major trade route, and underwater cables cross here too. So, not only is it a key shipping lane, but it also plays a massive role in China's military strategy, especially for submarines. They've got to keep things quiet, and the Bashi Channel is perfect for that. Then we've got the second line near the Luzon Strait. It's pretty close to the Dongsha Islands, and the depth here is like more than 3,000 meters. This area is important for military purposes too: submarines, warships, you name it. It's like just a really strategic spot. Next, we have the Manila Trench. This one's only about 130 kilometers away from the Scarborough Shoal, which is a key area for the Philippines. And not to get too technical, but this spot is also like a natural boundary between China and Southeast Asia. Pretty important, right? Then there's the line near the Spratlys, right between the Nansha Islands and the Philippines. This is also like a key dividing line in the region, but also a spot of contention for a lot of countries. You can see that, historically, China has been asserting its presence here for a long time. So the fifth line, it's located in the South Sand Trench, which is right on the southeast edge of the Nansha Islands. Now, this is a huge, really deep trench. We're talking about 680 kilometers long, and the average depth? It's more than 2 kilometers deep, and in some places, it goes all the way down to 3,300 meters. That's some serious depth. Next, we've got the sixth line, which is south of the Zunmu Ansha, at the southernmost tip of China's territorial map. If you go just a little bit further, you're already hitting Malaysia's border. This area, it's rich in fisheries, really rich. Then moving on to the seventh line, which is between the Nansha Islands and the Indonesian islands. Just slightly inward from this line, you've got China's Wannan Shoal. And I gotta tell you, this spot is basically the guardian of the South China Sea. The eighth line is located between the Nansha Islands and Vietnam. Now this one is super close to Vietnam's Cam Ranh Bay. And Cam Ranh Bay? It's actually a natural harbor that's perfect for docking aircraft carriers. In fact, it's one of the most important naval bases in southern Vietnam. Finally, we've got the ninth line, which is between the Shisha Islands and Vietnam. And get this, it's only about 110 kilometers from Vietnam's Dien port. And if you look at the port, it's not just a port, it's got an air base for the Vietnamese Air Force as well. Honestly, once you look at the map, it's pretty clear. The 9-line is getting really close to everyone else's doorstep. And of course, countries like the Philippines are up in arms, claiming that it should be there since it's so close to them. But here's the thing. That logic is, well, pretty much nonsensical. Like, let's just put it out there. Back in 1912, when the baseline for the South China Sea was first drawn, the countries around it were all colonies. They weren't even independent yet, right? So, how could they claim sovereignty when they didn't have independence in the first place? Now, if we follow their logic, where proximity equals ownership, then, the Philippines is really close to China. And Vietnam is literally at China's front door. Does that mean those countries should belong to China too? Well, China's not exactly against the idea of, taking that logic seriously. But let's be real here. I don't think the Philippines or the US would be on board with that. When you talk about the historical and legal basis for the 9-line, there's no denying that the islands within this line, historically speaking, have been a part of China. It's not up for debate. Let's start with historical rights. According to international law, it's all about who discovered it first, who named it first, and who governed it first. And guess what? China was the one that first discovered, named, and controlled these islands, even back in the pre-Qin and Han dynasties. Fast forward through the Tang, Song, Ming, and Qin dynasties, and China was still in charge. The earliest records show Chinese exploration and governance in the South China Sea. Think about the story of Su Fu during the Qin dynasty. He was sent by the emperor to find immortality, and along the way, he passed by islands that are now part of China's claim. This is some deep-rooted history we're talking about. Then, let's talk about the legal side. In 1887, China and France signed an agreement, and Article 3 clearly stated that all islands from the 108° east longitude were China's territory. France, back then, recognized China's sovereignty over the South China Sea islands. And since Vietnam was a French colony, they couldn't make a claim against China's sovereignty. By the 1930s, the nationalist government of China standardized the naming of the South China Sea islands, giving them both Chinese and English names. They also published maps clearly showing China's control. In 1935, they even drew the U-shaped line that became the precursor to the 9-line. And this was all publicly recognized. In 1947, China officially published a map of the South China Sea islands, outlining the 9-line. At that time, the Philippines had just gained independence from colonial powers and, well, wasn't really in a position to claim anything out there in the sea. They were more or less like a baby learning to walk, relying heavily on the US for military and political support. Same goes for Vietnam, which had just driven out the French but was then caught in a split, only fully reuniting in 1976 with China's help. Malaysia, at that point, wasn't even fully independent, so how could they possibly challenge China's sovereignty in the South China Sea? After 1949, when the nationalist government fled to Taiwan, the new People's Republic of China rightfully took over governance of the South China Sea islands, continuing its historical claim. In the 1950s, China even showed goodwill by removing the 10th and 11th lines from the 9-line to foster better relations with Vietnam. And from then on, the 9-line was solidified. So, until the late 1960s, the international community didn't really question the 9-line. Even during the Cold War, both the US and the Soviet Union, along with many Asian countries, recognized China's claims. It wasn't until the late 70s that other neighboring countries started to stir the pot. Probably because they realized how vital the South China Sea was for shipping routes, naval power, and of course, natural resources like oil and gas. But here's where things got tricky. At that time, China's modern navy was still in its early stages, and it didn't have full control over some of the distant islands. So, a lot of islands were illegally occupied by others. And that's when the Western powers like the US and the UK started getting involved, pushing the narrative of the United Nations Law of the Sea and questioning China's historical rights. But here's the thing. The United Nations Law of the Sea wasn't even effective until 1994, 35 years after China had already drawn the 9-dash line. This law came way late to the party, and it doesn't change China's historical sovereignty over the South China Sea. It's got no legal or historical basis to challenge that. So, yeah, this whole argument against China's claims, it just doesn't hold water. So, bottom line, China's got deep, undeniable historical and legal claims to the South China Sea. Period.